For hundreds of years, the story of the Hopi people was told one way. But a tiny piece of ancient DNA just cracked that story wide open. Before we go further, do one thing for me. If you have ever wondered where your own roots really come from, stay close, because this story might change how you see your own family too. The Hopi live in northern Arizona. Their villages sit on top of high desert cliffs called mesas. Some of these villages have been lived in for more than 1,000 years. That makes them some of the oldest, continuously inhabited communities in all of North America. For generations, the outside world told a simple story about the Hopi. It said they were just one more Native American group, part of a large wave of people who crossed into the Americas long ago and slowly spread out across the land. Simple, clean, easy to put in a textbook. But real history is almost never that simple. The Hopi themselves have always told a different story. Their oral traditions speak of long journeys, of migrations from faraway places, of ancestors who moved across land and time, guided by signs, by prophecy, by survival itself. For a long time, outsiders treated these stories as myth. Beautiful, maybe, but not real history. Then science started listening in a new way. Ancient DNA research is one of the most powerful tools we have ever created. It lets scientists take incredibly small samples, sometimes just a fragment of bone or a strand of ancient hair, and read a story hidden inside it. A story written not in books, but in the human body itself. When researchers began applying these tools to remains connected to the ancestors of the Hopi and nearby communities, something strange started to appear. The genetic patterns did not match the simple, single-origin story that had been repeated for so long. Instead, they hinted at something deeper, something layered, multiple ancient populations, different migration paths, connections stretching further back and further across the continent than most people ever imagined. In other words, the Hopi were not simply one thread in history. They may be a knot where several threads meet. Let that sit with you for a second. For hundreds of years, textbooks flattened indigenous history into a single line. One people, one path, one arrival. But what if that line was never a line at all? What if it was always a web? This is where the story starts to get emotional, because this is not just about ancient bones and lab results. This is about identity, about who gets to tell a people's story, about whether outside science can even fully capture something a community has always known in their own way. For the Hopi, oral history is not just folklore. It is memory passed down like a sacred thread, generation to generation. Elders speak of a great migration story, of clans moving from different directions, from the south, from the north, sometimes from unexpected distances, before eventually converging in the high desert of what is now Arizona. For a long time, some researchers dismissed migration stories like this as symbolic rather than literal, but ancient DNA is starting to suggest something uncomfortable for that old assumption. What if these migration stories were not just symbolic? What if they were, in some form, actual memory of real movement carried forward for centuries through language and ceremony? If that is true, it means indigenous oral tradition may have preserved real historical truth long before Western science ever developed the tools to test it. Sit with that for a moment. While European history relied on written records and monuments, indigenous nations like the Hopi were carrying history a different way, through voice, through memory, through ceremony, song, and story passed carefully from elder to child, generation after generation, for possibly over 1,000 years. And now, modern science may be circling back to confirm what elders were saying all along. If this idea is landing with you, drop just one word in the comments: memory. That single word means you understand that history is not only written in books, sometimes it is carried in voices. Now let's go deeper into what the DNA evidence actually suggests, because this is where the story gets even more surprising. Genetic studies on ancient remains from the American Southwest have shown patterns connecting to multiple ancestral populations. Some genetic threads trace back to early peoples who moved through the continent thousands of years ago. Other threads suggest later arrivals, possibly connected to different migration waves moving through different regions over long periods of time. This means the ancestors of the Hopi were not isolated in one single spot for their entire history. Their story includes movement, contact, possibly blending with neighboring groups over centuries. Some researchers believe this supports a picture where ancestral Puebloan peoples, sometimes referred to in the past by the term Anasazi, though many indigenous communities today prefer other names for their own ancestors, were part of a larger, interconnected world. Trade routes stretched across huge distances. Ideas moved, people moved, genes moved. This challenges another old myth, the myth that ancient indigenous communities lived in small, disconnected bubbles, cut off from the wider world. The evidence increasingly suggests something almost the opposite. Long before European contact, indigenous nations across North America were part of wide, complex networks, trading turquoise, trading feathers, trading pottery styles, trading ideas. The Hopi Mesas were not an isolated island in history. They may have been more like a crossroads, on a meeting point where different ancestral lines eventually settled and built one of the most enduring communities in the entire continent. Here is where the story becomes even more layered, because this raises a hard question. If ancestry is this complex, this blended, this connected to multiple ancient populations, what does that mean for identity today? For many indigenous communities, identity is not only about genetics, it is about relationship to land, relationship to community, relationship to language, ceremony, and responsibility passed down through generations. DNA can offer clues about migration and ancient population history, but it cannot capture culture. It cannot capture belonging. It cannot capture what it feels like to stand on land your ancestors have protected for over 1,000 years. This is why many indigenous scholars urge caution when it comes to ancient DNA research. The science can be powerful, but it can also be misused. Historically, outside researchers have sometimes taken samples from indigenous remains without proper consent, treating ancestors like specimens rather than people. This has caused real pain and real mistrust, and rightly so. Because of this, some native nations, including groups connected to the Hopi, have set strict rules about research involving ancestral remains. They are not against knowledge. Many are deeply curious about their own deep history too. But they insist that this knowledge be gathered with respect, with permission, and with the community's voice included every step of the way. This is an important layer of the story that often gets left out. Ancient DNA does not just reveal ancient history, it also reveals how history has often been handled without asking the people involved. If you are starting to feel how deep this story goes, take a slow breath with me for a second, because we are only halfway through the mystery. Let's go back to the desert. Let's go back to the mesas. Picture standing on top of one of these cliffs at sunrise. Below you, the desert stretches out in gold and orange light. The wind moves slow and steady, and beneath your feet is a village that has been alive, generation after generation, for over 1,000 years. Now imagine knowing that beneath that same ground lie clues, tiny fragments of biological history, fragments that, if studied carefully and respectfully, could help fill in gaps of a story that stretches back thousands of years before recorded history even began in most of the world. That is the emotional core of this mystery. It is not just a puzzle about ancient migration paths. It is a story about deep human roots, about resilience, about a community that has survived droughts, invasions, colonization, forced relocation attempts, and centuries of outside pressure, and is still here today, still speaking their language, still practicing their ceremonies, still living on ancestral land. Some researchers believe the layered genetic story of the Hopi region reflects something profound about human history in general. Populations are rarely pure, single, unchanging lines. They are usually blends, mixtures shaped by movement, adaptation, survival, and connection. This is not only true for the Hopi, it may be true for almost every group of humans on Earth, once you dig deep enough into ancient DNA. But because the Hopi story is so old, so continuous, and so well preserved through oral tradition, it offers scientists a rare window into just how complex ancient American history really was. Now, here is where the story takes another turn, because ancient DNA has also opened debates that historians and scientists are still working through carefully. Some studies, looking at ancient remains from the broader Southwest region, have suggested surprising links, hinting that certain ancestral groups may share genetic connections stretching in directions that surprise even researchers. Some evidence points toward links with ancient peoples further south, in what is now Mexico and Central America. Other evidence suggests older, deeper connections, tracing back to some of the very first people who ever moved into the Americas thousands and thousands of years ago. This has led some historians to reconsider old ideas about how indigenous civilizations across North and Central America may have been connected long before Europeans ever set foot on the continent. Trade networks, shared farming techniques like growing corn, beans, and squash together, shared spiritual symbols, shared architectural styles seen in mesatop structures and other ancient sites. Some researchers even believe certain cultural and religious ideas, including elements connected to Katsina ceremonies practiced by the Hopi today, may reflect influence or connection from far-reaching ancient trade and migration networks stretching deep into Mesoamerica. This remains debated among historians and archaeologists, and it is important to say clearly this is still an active area of research, not a settled fact. But even as a possibility, it is a powerful one. It suggests ancient America was not a patchwork of separate, disconnected worlds. It may have been part of one much larger, ancient, interconnected human story. If this idea excites you the way it excites me, share this video with someone who loves ancient mysteries. Somebody out there needs to hear this story today. Now let's bring this back to something deeply human, because underneath all of this science is something simple and powerful. This is a story about survival against incredible odds. Think about everything the ancestors of the Hopi endured across centuries. Long droughts that forced difficult decisions about where to live and how to grow food in one of the harshest climates in North America. Waves of contact and sometimes conflict with neighboring groups. Later, the arrival of Spanish colonizers, bringing disease, forced labor, and attempts to erase indigenous religion and identity. In the late 1600s, many Pueblo communities across the Southwest rose up together in a powerful act of resistance now remembered as the Pueblo Revolt, pushing colonial forces out of the region for a period of time. The Hopi, living on their high desert mesas, were part of this wider world of resistance and survival. Later, still came the pressures of American expansion, forced boarding schools designed to strip indigenous children of their language and culture, government policies aimed at erasing tribal identity altogether. And yet, through all of it, the Hopi people are still here, still speaking Hopi, still performing ceremonies passed down for centuries, still living, in many cases, on the very same mesas their ancestors called home over 1,000 years ago. This is where ancient DNA research and living culture meet in the most emotional way possible. The genetic story shows deep, layered ancient roots. The living culture shows unbroken resilience across those same centuries. Together, they tell a story far bigger than a simple textbook paragraph ever could. This is why some historians now argue we need to completely rethink how ancient indigenous history is taught, not as a simple footnote before European history begins, but as a rich, complex, deeply connected civilization stretching back thousands of years, filled with movement, trade, survival, and evolving identity. If you're starting to feel like everything you learned about ancient indigenous history barely scratched the surface, you are not alone. Many historians are saying the exact same thing right now. Let's take a moment to talk about why this story matters far beyond just one community. Every human being alive today carries an ancient story inside their DNA. Most of us will never fully know it. But when ancient DNA research is done carefully, respectfully, and in partnership with descendant communities, it becomes something incredibly powerful. It becomes a bridge between forgotten history and living memory. For the Hopi, this research offers a chance to see their oral traditions reflected, at least in part, through an entirely different lens. Not replacing their traditional knowledge, not overriding it, but standing beside it, offering another way of confirming just how deep, layered, and connected their history truly is. Some Hopi cultural leaders and scholars have expressed cautious interest in this kind of research, while also insisting that Western science should never be treated as the final authority on indigenous history. Their own oral traditions have carried real historical truth for centuries already. Science, when done respectfully, can support that truth, but it should never try to replace it. This balance between ancient science and living tradition is one of the most important lessons hidden inside this entire story. Now, here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If ancient DNA can reveal hidden layers in a story as old and as carefully preserved as the Hopis, what hidden layers might exist in your own family history? Most of us think we know where we come from. A city, a country, a simple family tree drawn on a school project years ago. But ancient migration, mixing, and movement shaped almost every human population on Earth. Very few family stories are as simple as they seem on the surface. Maybe that is the biggest emotional takeaway from this entire mystery. History is rarely a straight line. It is almost always a web, layers folded into layers, movements folded into movements. And sometimes, the oldest stories, the ones passed down through voice and memory rather than written record, turn out to hold truths modern science is only just beginning to catch up to. Let's bring this story to its final turn. For centuries, outsiders assumed they already understood who the Hopi were. A single tribe, a single origin, a simple chapter in a much larger American story. But ancient DNA has shown that assumption was too small for the truth. The real story is bigger, more complex, more connected to a wider ancient world than most people ever imagined. It is a story of migration and memory, of resilience through unimaginable hardship, of a people who never stopped telling their own story, even when the outside world refused to listen. And now, slowly, carefully, science is beginning to listen too. But even with all of these new discoveries, one truth stands above everything else. The most powerful evidence of who the Hopi are is not hidden only in ancient DNA. It is standing right now on top of those same desert mesas, in the form of a living, breathing culture that never disappeared. Every ceremony still performed, every word still spoken in the Hopi language, every story still told to a child by an elder under a quiet desert sky. That is not just history, that is proof. Proof that some stories cannot be erased no matter how many centuries try. Ancient DNA gave us a new way to glimpse deep into the past. But it did not create the truth of who the Hopi are. It only confirmed what their own voices had been saying all along. Maybe that is the real lesson hidden in this mystery. Sometimes the most powerful history is not the kind hidden in a lab. It is the kind carried gently, faithfully, generation after generation, in memory and language, and in the quiet strength of people who simply refuse to be forgotten. If this story moved something in you, sit with it for a second before you scroll away. Somewhere out there, someone else's ancestors are still waiting for their story to be told with the same care. Maybe after watching this, you'll be the one who helps that happen.